Welcome to our final study of 1 Samuel. So far, we've covered quite a bit of territory, met more than a few fascinating characters along the way, and we've learned more than a couple important lessons about God and what it means to do life with Him. And we begin this by calling our study Entering into 1 Samuel, because we noted then that our goal is not so much to bring 1 Samuel into our world, but by grace and through the Spirit to enter into this world that is created, is generated for us by this text, this world of God ruling over things in such a way that we do well to take note. And so in keeping with our metaphor of entering into the text, while there's a sense in which we never want to leave the world that is generated by the Bible, it is probably beneficial for us to acknowledge that when it comes to this particular study, our time to exit has arrived. And so I want to do a few things with this final episode. Really, it's just encourage you. And I want to encourage you in three particular ways. The first two will be quick. The third will take a little bit more time. One of the things that I want you to encourage you to do when it comes to this voyage through 1 Samuel that we've been engaging on is to return. I certainly hope this study has been a blessing to you, but I don't want this to be the only time you study 1 Samuel. I can tell you for my part, digging into these things a bit more than I had previously and thinking through some of the lessons that emerge and the truths that are imposed upon us by the claims of this text, I want to come back, and I plan on doing so. And I encourage you to do the same. There's so much more that we can learn and gain. And sometimes it's new things we hadn't seen, but other times it's being brought deeper into these things that we have. And so my first encouragement to you is to return, is to come back to 1 Samuel again and again and again, and to read through this book, mining for the wisdom of God that He reveals when we pay attention to His Word. And the second thing that I want to encourage you to do is more of a looking forward, from what we've studied again. I want you to encourage you to continue journeying from here. And I mean this in a couple of different ways. One of the things I mean is, study 2 Samuel. And perhaps there may come a time when we'll study it in this fashion, though that may be some time from now. So for what it's worth, you have a Bible, read it. Let's remember what we mentioned right at the very top, that we kind of we separate these books out into 1 and 2 Samuel, and the separation is a little bit artificial. The only reason why we have two of them is because scrolls are only so long, and in the ancient world, that's how they kept their books. And so it's somewhat arbitrary that there's a first and a second. So really, it's like we're just essentially cutting off the story midway through. So you continue studying the story that Samuel tells, the story that goes under his name as David continues to move toward the throne, and we see such important things in that regard. And I also mean, though, to continue living out the story that 1 Samuel is telling. We'll learn a bit about what we've seen with respect to God's sovereignty, and as we learn that, we have to remember that God's sovereignty is no less active. God's mission is no less alive today than it was during Israel's transition from a tribal confederacy to a centralized monarchy. And among the many bits of wisdom that we've picked up along the way is the notion that what counts at the moment is not how your story began or where you've been up to this point, but where you go from here. Sometimes stories of success end in failure. Sometimes stories of failure actually end in success. And so we move on from this, and we move on continuing to live out the story, taking it from this point and moving forward. So before we leave, let's do one more thing. Let's take stock. And what I want to say in this regard is it would be easy to just write the word remember, but that's not specific enough. But what I want to encourage you to do is to take seriously what we've learned. So sure, remember it. That's what we're talking about, to remember the wisdom that we've gained from this book. And what we mean, remember it in the thick sense, not just of have it up there so that you could recall it if you were asked, so that you could pass a quiz on 1 Samuel, but we're talking about remember in the sense of bringing these things back to mind so that we might pull them together and base our lives on these things, to take seriously what we've learned about what God from what God has revealed. And so I want to just do that with you. I want to take stock on a couple of things, and we'll keep it fairly tight. I'd like to pay attention to two things that we have learned here about God, two things that we've learned here about sin, and two things that we've learned here about discipleship. And so let's start with God. To suggest that there would only be two things here is silly, and you of course don't know that I don't mean we've not learned more than that, but we have learned a few things about God that we do well to keep in mind. I want to take you back to something that we talked about early on in the study, and it was in the story in chapters 4 through 7 when the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines and it's brought into their various cities, and it's initially placed in the temple, in the dwelling place of their god Dagon. And you may recall what happened. The Ark has been taken away, and they place it in that temple, and then at night Dagon falls. So they pick him back up, kind of embarrassing, and then the next night he falls again, and his head's cut off, and so you have this demonstration as it continues. Everywhere the ark goes, God inflicts judgment on Philistine or Israelite alike. And it shows us that God is capable of taking care of himself. And we noted at the moment that God is not codependent. I think that's really good language to use in our therapeutic age. I want to introduce you to another, a little bit more technical term that has sometimes been used in the study of God, and that is the term aseity or aseity. The word has the meaning of something that derives its existence from within itself and therefore is totally self-sufficient. Properly speaking, the term only applies to God, and is a term that reminds us that God indeed derives his existence from no source outside of himself and therefore is internally sufficient. He does not need the world. This is a critical piece of theology. God does not need the world in order to be God. He is not dependent on us in order for him to be fully who he is. He is fully who he is within himself, and he creates as the overflow of that. He is happy to invite you to partner with him to play an important role in his story. But the point of this, the upshot, is that God does not need us. He does not rely on us, happy to use us, but does not need us. So we need not think that God is, sort of sitting around panicky, hoping that we'll do the right thing. No, he absolutely is vestedly interested in us doing the right thing. But God is self-existent and therefore self-sufficient. God's fine. His plan will continue no matter what, and you need not worry in this regard. And I suppose the second thing I want to say about God is really pretty similar, but it's a more popular term. I'll just abbreviate it with the letters S-O-V. You know the word sovereignty. Actually, let's do both. Let's also go with sovereignty, and then of course the not so much synonym, but the associated term providence. So sovprav. I want to talk about God's sovereignty, and I want to talk about his providence. And I don't know that you'd be as familiar with the term providence, but let's break these terms down. Sovereign is an important word for 1 Samuel because it's a word that refers to the person who rules the world. We even today in our political discourse will at times refer to, the sovereign, meaning the ruler. It was, of course, especially more a term that was used in the time of kings. And so we see here that God is sovereign. He's the only one qualified to rule the world. That, of course, is part of the point of what was so wrong with Israel demanding a king like all the other nations. No, you don't know how the world needs to be run. We don't know how the world needs to be run. God does. He is the only one qualified to rule the world because he alone has unmatched power and wisdom and love. And so he is the king. And yet I'd like to also suggest that you bring into your understanding of God the concept of providence. It's kind of the other side of the coin of sovereignty. Providence is a way of referring specifically to God's guidance of the world to good ends. We talk about things being providential, and we mean by that this seems to have somehow been planned or written into a plan that is designed to bring about good. And indeed, that's precisely what you see here in 1 Samuel. God is governing the story, and he's doing so in such a way that brings about his good purposes for all, and the blessing to those who believe in him. And there's a couple of things we could say in this regard. We need to never forget what Hannah sang, that God's ruling of the world often involves a reversal of what we might think is normal. We might think that those up in power are in a great place. Well, not so much, because God is ruling the world. And don't get too arrogant or prideful in your positions of ability or strength, because God indeed will bring you down. There's a reversal here. You also would do well to think in this regard about those times in the story when it almost seems like God responds to what happens, and so God regrets making Saul king, and we wonder what to do with this theologically. And again, it's important to realize how we should read the Bible in this sense. And there are some portions of the Bible that seem to indicate that God knows the end from the beginning, and he has a plan that won't change. And there are other parts of the Bible that indicate more so, almost make it seem like God is a character within the story, and you have to understand how to bring those things together. And they come together in the realization that God does indeed know the end from the beginning and has a plan for all things. But these stories of real interaction are designed to show us that we genuinely engage. Like God is not bound within time, but he's also not outside of it. Like he transcends the difference in such a way that our actions matter. And so you might be getting lost in some of the deep theology because these waters are not always the easiest to wade through. But the point is that this story actually indicates to us that our free will is real and our engagement in our next actions do matter. And yet at the same time, God will bring good out of all things. I don't know if you guys remember the preacher from years ago, Chuck Swindoll. I haven't heard his name in a long time, but I remember growing up, my mom used to listen to his preaching and it would be on the radio in the morning. And I was just doing some kind of informal research on 1 Samuel, and I came across some of the thoughts that he had said years ago in some context. I don't even know when and where it was, but I loved the idea. He said he pointed out God's providence. He said, you notice this in the small things. It's the rivalry between Hannah and Peninnah that brings about the birth of Samuel. It's the fact that Saul was led to Samuel while he was on a search for these lost donkeys. It's the fact that David became aware of the Goliath problem. He was sent on a simple mission to bring bread to his brothers. And we see in this not just the action of humans, but the providence of God. And the encouragement here is that no matter what is happening in or around you, God is capable of bringing this together in ways that bring about good for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. And we could talk about God all day long, but from 1 Samuel, please remember that God is self-sufficient, happy to use you, but doesn't need you, and that God is the only one fit to rule the world, and he indeed governs it providentially in a way that brings about good. Let's transition and say a couple things about sin. Once more, unfortunately, we could probably talk for way too long about sin from 1 Samuel because we learned too much, but let me just make 2 points. Let me suggest to you that 1 Samuel tells us, first of all, to mind what you hear, and secondly, to mind what you fear. First of all, mind what you hear. From Samuel to Saul to David, the question is which voice you hear. Think about how Samuel's story began, laying in the house of God and learning to hear, recognize, and heed the voice of God. You think about how Samuel's story ends in Endor at the home of this medium, this spiritist, this necromancer. And he's seeking the wrong voice. And so who you hear matters. And Samuel and Saul interpreted their circumstances very differently. I want you to notice this. Like they seemed to see the world differently. And this is precisely why. I'll tell you personally, one of the things I will take most close to heart from this particular time through 1 Samuel is the idea that those who hear the word see the world. Those who hear the word with a spirit of humility and a readiness to act alone are able to see the world accurately and discern what next best to do. And so we notice here a call to mind what we hear, because if you listen to the wrong voices, this is what begins to pull you into sin. This is what begins to take you away from God and his purposes for your life. And likewise, they're not so much separate things, but different sides of the same thing. Mind what you fear. Saul is characterized by fear from start to finish, and the fear only increases as his story unfolds. And yet in this, Saul is in many ways just the mirror of Israel. Saul is precisely what she asked for, and perhaps part of why God gave her this particular king is to show her the ugly truth about herself, us, the ugly truths about ourselves. And what's wild is, like, we don't know what Israel's story would have been like had she not asked for a king. We don't know how things would have played out had she not given into fear, but we recognize that this is always where sin begins. It's where sin began for Israel, the fear that God was not able to take care of them during this time of transition, the fear that the other people around them had it made, whereas they were struggling unnecessarily. And it recalls Genesis 3, where there was this fear that God is holding out on us. Are we sure that we can trust him? Sin always begins with a sneaking suspicion that maybe God is holding out, and we're afraid because we're not sure if he's trustworthy, and so we're led into the wrong voices, and as a result, we sin. We do well, of course, to pay attention to these things, but perhaps keeping them in mind, we can continue on and note our last theme. I'm going to call it discipleship. I recognize that it's not a term that's used in 1 Samuel, but I also want to unequivocally state that we read 1 Samuel as disciples of Jesus. And so this book becomes part of Jesus's guidance in our lives. It becomes a medium of sorts. That's probably not the best word in this regard, but it becomes a vessel for the voice of Jesus. And so what do we learn about discipleship? I think there's an obvious one and there's a subtle one that I want to point out here. The obvious one is probably what you would say, and it's a word that we come to know. Know and love? Well, I suppose it depends. It's the word obey. Obedience. I mean, that's the theme here. What God requires, simply put, is obedience, real obedience. And we learn in 1 Samuel about some of what this means. Temporary obedience, I'll obey you for a while, but not in the end. That's disobedience. partial obedience. I'll obey you in part, but not all the way. That's disobedience. Like delayed obedience, that's disobedience. And so we recognize here very clearly that the call for us is to obey. To obey is better than sacrifice. That's the hard lesson that Saul learned in chapter 15. Look, I don't know what you mean. I know I was told to destroy the Amalekites, but surely God is going to be pleased with us destroying most of them and offering sacrifices to show our devotion. And Samuel says this famous line, no. Today, to obey is better than sacrifice. Heed the voice of the Lord is more desirable to him than fattened calves and lambs and other animals. And maybe you recall that line. I don't know the last time you read Mark chapter 12, the conversation between Jesus and a teacher who's not far from the kingdom. That's what Jesus says. In Mark chapter 12, it comes at the end of a lot of people who are trying to oppose Jesus, asking him questions to get him into trouble. And then somebody comes up to Jesus and says, what's the most important command? And he answers, well, love the Lord with everything. And the second's like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And in Mark's version of the story, the man says, you've answered well, because to obey is better than sacrifice. And Jesus actually said to him, you're not far from the kingdom of God. Because when you recognize that obedience is what God calls for, that means you have an understanding that God is the one who wants to be your king. And to obey is hard, man. And Samuel, it's difficult. It's a contested reality. To obey is to wait, and to obey is to trust. To obey is not to trust your own instincts. To obey is not to take matters into your own hands. It requires courage and patience and faith. And so we have the obvious reality that obedience is that which God calls for, but there's a subtle one that I'd like to draw out that I think may be easy to miss, in part because it is subtle, but also because it's like not the kind of thing we like to be told. I'm just going to write one word, and the word is rebuke. But I'm not talking about rebuking. I'm talking about receiving rebuke. I'm talking about accepting rebuke. You can maybe tell more about a person by how they accept rebuke than by anything else. And Saul actually shows us the opposite of accepting rebuke every time. When Samuel showed up in chapter 13 and called him out for not doing what he was told, not obeying the word of the prophet, to wait until that point of the seventh day when Samuel arrived, and Saul was waiting, and day 7 is here, it's not over, but it's here, and everything's happening. And so he does what he's not supposed to do. He offers these sacrifices, and Samuel shows up, and he rebukes him. And what does Saul do? He makes excuses. Well, the men were getting restless and starting to leave, and the Philistines are coming down on me, and you were late. And he just blames. That's not the way to receive a rebuke. And it gets even worse in chapter 15 when, of course, Saul is told to destroy the Amalekites, and he doesn't. And Samuel shows up, and what does Saul do? He says, oh, it's good to see you. And Samuel says, why didn't you do what the Lord said? And he straight up lied. I've carried out the Lord's commands. And he even doubles down on this before he finally admits, Indeed, I was once again afraid. So Saul shows us negatively the importance of being rebukable. And meanwhile, David shows us the way. Like you, probably, I really wrestle sometimes with seeing David as this heroic figure. I really wrestle with seeing him as a man after God's own heart. I wonder, probably again with you, how he can be so commended despite his many faults and serious sins. And I think that 1 Samuel presents this idea as near the heart of the difference between the two, this right here. David is certainly capable of ignoring baseless accusations like that of his older brother Eliab when he was inquiring about Goliath. But at the same time, he humbly hears, say, Abigail's rebuke. And these things are connected, rebuke and obedience. Gosh, one of the scariest revelations from 1 Samuel is that whereas obedience breeds more obedience, disobedience does the same. Disobedience breeds more disobedience. That's terrifying. Samuel, the book, has its own spiritual psychology, and while it operates in a different register than our own, we do well to pay close attention, because what it's saying to us as we lean in and listen is how you respond to God this time is going to increase the likelihood of how you respond next time. The more you disobey, the more you're going to find yourself becoming a person who disobeys. The more you reject the rebuke, the more you're going to find yourself becoming a person who rejects the rebuke. And that's scary for people like us who don't always do the right thing. But that's why rebuke is such a gift, because it interrupts the cycle. Man, and judging from the book of Proverbs and and how much the book of Proverbs makes of the wise person being one who receives a rebuke with gratitude, it certainly seems like Solomon learned this lesson from his father. Y'all, let's learn it too. And I know this may seem like an odd way to end our time studying this book. It's a bit anticlimactic of sorts, but at the same time, it seems oddly appropriate. So let me end with this. God may soon send you a Samuel or an Abigail. Mind well how you hear. I hope this study of 1 Samuel has been as much of a blessing to you as it has been to me. God bless.